Hello and welcome to the first in a series of videos in which I'll explode some of the myths surrounding custom tactics and get into explanations of how they actually affect the way your team behaves on the pitch. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. I'm Steve Stokes, aka the Foot Coach, and in this video I'm going to guide you through the controversial and much misunderstood issue of depth. The first myth that I want to bust is the idea that the depth slider dictates how high your defensive line sits when you're in possession of the ball. In this clip, where I'm playing on one depth, pay attention to the radar at the bottom centre of the screen and note where my centre backs position themselves as play advances. They push right up to the halfway line and then they stop and sit. Now look at what happens when I change to 10 depth. Again, they push forward to the halfway line, and again, they just stop and sit. The positioning is identical. Changing the depth slider has no effect on this whatsoever, and it's actually impossible to cause your defensive line to sit any higher or lower than the halfway line once you advance play into your opponent's final third. Now for myth number 2. Let's explore the idea that you can spot a so-called Dropback Rat simply by considering how many defenders he has retreating into his 6-yard box whilst under attack. As expected, when I push the slider to 1 depth, my entire back 4 retreats into the penalty area when my opponent carries the ball into the corner. But when I move all the way up to 10 depth, look what happens. Exactly the same thing. The defence retreats to just the same depth. Now, the explanation for this is simple. In this situation, my defence has to stay in front of the attack's furthest forward player that's in an onside position. If they pushed forward and behind him, it would leave an easy pass to an unmarked player. And this is why defensive depth is always dictated by the position of the attackers. No matter whether you play 1 depth or 10, your defenders will always drop deep if attackers push high. Now that we know what the depth slider doesn't affect, let's take a look at what it actually does. Firstly, let's look at how it affects aggression and movement. With my defence on 1 depth, my defence retreats to accommodate the attacker that's furthest forward as per the previous clip. And when my opponent moves play back towards the halfway line, they maintain their position inside the penalty area, effectively making no attempt to push out or play the attackers into offside positions. Instead, they remain passive and dormant. But on 10 depth, the difference is staggering. As soon as the opponent moves play backwards, my defence rapidly and aggressively pushes forward, forcing the attackers to either go with them or be left in offside positions. And this is a key effect of moving the defensive depth slider. And in later videos that will be exclusively available to supporters of my Foot Academy Patreon, link in the description below, we'll look at how this and other effects can be exploited to our advantage. But before we get to that, let's finish by looking at some clips taken from a game where my defensive depth was set to 1 in the first half and 10 in the second. Again, you'll notice some startling differences in the way that the two systems operate. Here, we can see that as my opponent attacks, my defenders leave a comfortable cushion between themselves and the attackers, and they're ready to back away whenever the strikers get too close. Although they're briefly turned so that they face their own goal, their aim is to defend so that space is left in front of them rather than behind. And by dropping off and being so passive, they eventually allow my opponent to play a ball to his forward's feet and he scores an easy goal. Again, look at how passive the defence is when it's set to 1 depth. They want to play facing the opponent's goal and they'd rather backpedal than push up and try to catch the opposition offside. In this case, their passivity leaves a ton of room for a long-range effort. More of the same here. The pass to feet is always an option, whereas the through ball isn't. They're happy to concede space in front of themselves, but they don't want to leave any space behind. Eventually, again, there's plenty of space in front of the centre backs for the shot to be taken. Eventually, the docile nature of a one-depth defence is exploited when my opponent again plays the ball into the feet of Robben and my defence has no chance of closing down the shot. So that's one depth. What happens when we turn it up to 10? The first thing you'll notice is that the defensive line is more defiant and less passive. It tries to hold its position and is reluctant to back off even when my opponent runs at it aggressively. Again, here, it refuses to back down, and when it does drop slightly, it immediately steps forward again at the first chance, allowing for the through ball that leads to the free kick. It would much rather defend aggressively and risk leaving space behind for the opponent to run into. And in this clip, that space behind is almost exploited right away when Robben gets in behind Roberto Carlos. And when Zambrotta picks up a loose ball and retreats, the defence steps forward and pushes out of the box, leaving attackers in offside positions as per the previous clip. And finally, we again see the vulnerability of a defence set to 10 depth when it comes to through balls. So there we have it. That's the full lowdown on how the depth slider really affects your gameplay. Set it high and your defenders will aggressively look to push up and catch players offside, while at the same time being vulnerable to through balls. Or set it low and your defenders will look to contain the attack, while at the same time being vulnerable to leaving open space in front of them. So perhaps the answer is to set it at around about 5. Well, that's definitely an option. But if you do that, you risk being in a position where you're never quite sure whether your defence will react to a given situation passively or aggressively. The other alternative is to go somewhere close to the extremes and develop your art as either an aggressive risk taker or a more passive caretaker. Now that you have all the info you need, that choice is all yours. Goodbye for now.